Modern collecting of retro gaming can be quite expensive, and as someone who constantly seeks to find these pieces of gaming history, it can carry quite a price. Even with my budget, there's some occasions where I just simply can't afford games because they can be incredibly expensive, or for less, I can afford many more games for a console of my choice. But talking about price points, it can be weird because the market is dynamic, and I feel the only way to really cover this topic is to create 3 different episodes, one focusing on expensive games that are practical to buy, expensive games that are impractical to buy, and ones that are so rare that you'll never see them in person. Today I'm going to cover the ones that are practical to buy, games that cost less than $700, something that if you saved up a little, you could buy. With that being said, let's begin. I used to watch the shit out of the Jetsons, and until making this episode, I didn't even realize there was a Jetsons NES game. I know that the Flintstones had a few, but never this. So I booted it up, and it was made by a company I adore, Natsume. It's been a while since we've talked about these folks. For anyone who doesn't know, Natsume has been on quite a few of my top 10 lists. Abadox is a must-play on the NES, Wild Guns is a wonderful co-op title on the Super Nintendo, and Shatterhand has an amazing soundtrack. And here we are, whipping out $280 for a side-scrolling adventure game very loosely based on the TV show. The whole premise is that we play as George Jetson, who is going to interrupt a mining operation led by Mr. Cogswell, that's it. And it's a hard game too for being so simple. George is kind of an idiot, but he's a charming one, so he can pick up boxes and he can chuck them at enemies, he can use a jetpack, he can interact with switches. There's a lot you can do. It reminds me a lot of the mechanics of some of the licensed Disney titles from Capcom. Also, it's designed fairly well. I can't complain. There were tons of sports games on the NES, but in my opinion, hockey was severely underutilized, with only 4 games dedicated to it, in comparison to the 18 baseball games and 8 football titles. Pro Sports Hockey was one of the better ones. It was made by Jaleco, and from a graphical standpoint, I was genuinely impressed because in many ways, it has that aesthetic that EA's NHL series would take on, especially in their early years. My chief complaint was that it was really hard to anticipate the presence of your teammates, and in a game where you need to rely on your peers at any given time, I felt that it didn't do nearly as great as Blades of Steel. But that's just my opinion. Like when you're playing it, your teammates they're constantly behind you and off screen. It makes passing or setting up for a breakaway very, very difficult. Now, in my opinion, there's always room for improvement, and many companies did improve, even Jaleco, because they ported this to the Super Nintendo and it looks fucking phenomenal. It even had an energy bar. If you love hockey and just have to have this game, then be prepared to pay $300 on average for it. When you think of rare games that carry a price, most of the time it's going to have a 2 in it, because by the time many of these sequels came out, the NES was about to transition to the Super Nintendo in America. In fact, the NES's lifespan in the US was from 1985 to 1995, in stark comparison with the Famicom that was alive until 2003 in Japan. DuckTales II was released in 1993, and the one thing I want you to realize is that companies within the last 4 years of the NES's lifespan, they tapered down their releases. Nintendo required 10,000 units minimum, and this one, like many others, had a lower production rate. It is affordable though if you save up about $320 on a good day. In the game, we find Huey, Scrooge's great nephew, who finds a treasure map piece, and Huey, being curious about it, brings it to Scrooge, who recognizes it as a treasure map created by his great-great-uncle, Fergus McDuck. Scrooge, being the absolute mad lad capitalist opportunist that he is, sets out to find the rest of the missing pieces. If you like DuckTales 1, you're gonna love DuckTales 2 because everything that made the original great stayed. And that's one thing I can give props to Capcom for. Don't fix it if it isn't broken. Ever wanted to play a text-based adventure on the Nintendo Entertainment System? You could play Deja Vu, or you could pay $350 and buy Princess Tomato in the Salad Kingdom. This game has a cult following because it's absurd as absurd can be. It's like VeggieTales minus the Christianity. It's like Food Fight, but no Seth Rogen laughs. It's like a fever dream, except it's Japan, so I'm not really surprised. One time I saw a Japanese TV show where people got their nuts slapped with a paddle if they couldn't get a tongue twister correctly, and it was on normal, low-channel television. There were kids watching it, just giggling. That's the beauty of the Japanese culture, the humor and absurdity, and how it's accepted. Now, this game was much more popular in Japan, and a vast majority of home computers in Japan supported it. The MSX, PC 6001, PC 8801, FM7, you name it. But for some weird reason, they ported it to the Famicom, and by proxy, the United States. Now, this is funny because usually when something exceptionally far out happens in Japan, we don't tend to see it, especially if something wasn't inherently culturally relevant or if Japan felt that America wouldn't be receptive to it. But Hudson was feeling quirky, and we got it. We play as Sir Cucumber, we go on a quest to kill Minister Pumpkin, who kidnapped Princess Tomato. That's it. Oftentimes regarded as one of the best shooters on the NES, Gunak is a compile game, much like Xanac, which is part of a larger franchise, Aleste, at least by technicality. If you're me, you got your ass spanked with a spatula by Xanac, and you passed on this game because you thought that there were flying carrots on the cover. I truly did, and in some weird way, I still think they are. Looks like I got another Knack game to play. This one in particular can be pricey, roughly $350, much like Princess Tomato in the Salad Kingdom. As with most compile shooters, it's tough too. Compile really enjoys placing the consumer in shitty situations in a vertical environment. And honestly, I don't mind it. My chief complaint is when I can't discern objects that can kill me from the environment. That's where I start to get upset. The game is simple. We play as Commander Gunak and we fly a ship shooting anything and everything. Earth's resources have been depleted and it's time to move on to our next mistake, an artificial solar system called Iota Synthetica. Now, usually when I talk about inanimate objects being the focal point of combat buffoonery, I complain. Twin B, not in this case. The plot actually states that a cosmic wave animated inanimate objects, and Gunak, the son of Xanac, spelled differently, but nice reference, Compile, has to go shoot it down. It's worth checking out. Cowboy Kid it's a Western Ganbare Goemon, if you're familiar with that style of game. Running left and right, killing bad guys, walking into random buildings, exploring caves. In fact, if you told me this was a carbon copy of Ganbare Goemon 2 retrofitted as a Western, I'd believe you, but that's not the case. It's a faithful inspiration from Pixel, a company that not a lot of people know because a majority of their games were Japanese. The ones you might know are Over Horizon, one of the most difficult NES Zapper games, World Champ, a boxing game, and this game, which if you want to own will cost roughly $375. It's a neat little game. I know I make a lot of callbacks to Ganbare Goemon 2, but the weapon system in this is fairly decent. If you die, you don't lose the weapons. Once you find it, it's yours. This game did have a fairly low release rate, and that's why it tends to be more on the expensive side, but I do think it's worth checking out. Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers is an amazing game, and when it comes to Disney Capcom titles for the NES, you'd be hard-pressed to find one that isn't fun. They always just seem to hit the nail on the head from a design perspective. I love the physics of the first game and how approachable it is for kids, and in my case, if you have multiple kids, even better because Capcom allowed for a two-person co-op in this game. Then we have the sequel, and much like DuckTales II, Capcom stuck to their roots of not messing up something good. The only big difference for me is that there isn't a map screen, no sense in having it, all the levels are linear. We play as Chip 'n Dale, and our objective is to figure out where Fat Cat is and what he's up to. We figure out he's looking for this Egyptian urn so he can do malfeasance, and that's it. It's just good, clean fun. Speaking of clean, you'll need to do some cleaning of your bank account if you want this one. This is easily a $400 game, and that's just for a loose copy. It'll likely be double if you're going complete in box. Another interesting thing is that usually when we have an expensive game on the NES, it tends not to be as expensive in Japan. That's not the case for this one. You'll still fork out like $300 complete in box for it. I love Bobble. In fact, if you were to think of a face for Taito, it would be Bub and Bob, right? Bub and Bob walk so Cubby and Rubby, the protagonists of this game, could run. Much like Bubble Bobble, our protagonists have a friend, her name is Judy, and she gets kidnapped and it's our duty to save that booty. And we do that the same way we did in Bubble Bobble. We blow bubbles to trap enemies and we run up and we kick them in the dick. They spaz out, they die, we move on to the next board. Plain and simple. It's the same old song and dance, but it's worked for a long time for Taito, and it has phenomenal graphics. This almost made my list for the top 10 best looking NES because in some ways, it borders on 16-bit era graphics, at least the early ones. It's got a great aesthetic. Unfortunately, this game was released in 1993. In fact, it was one of the final 30 games created for the NES, and because of that, it costs a lot of money to own, $460 on the lower end, if you're lucky. This franchise does still exist, however. They actually released a game in 2019, Bubble Bobble for Friends, and it's really cute. You should check it out if you like Bubble Bobble, or at least did when it was relevant. So I've never played this, but I've seen it in tons of showcase boxes at game stores, and at no point ever did I look at it and say, damn, I really want that to collect dust on my shelf. This game is an oddity created by an equally odd company. Let's dissect this. The game itself was created by K's. They didn't do much in America, and a lot of their games were in Japan only, and even then, they did not specialize in video games. They specialized in pachinko and pinball. That's your first red flag. The second is that we play as a dismembered samurai head called Namakubi, floating around and destroying things such as zombies because the Dark Seed crashed in Nevada and emitted magnetic rays that turned everybody into zombies. And it also animates the fucking Statue of Liberty. That's our second red flag. I'm convinced that Norio Nakagata flew to Texas, found an entire fuckload of peyote, crushed it, shoved it up his ass, and rode the lightning to one of the weirdest games I've ever witnessed or talked about in my history of playing games. And I've played Cho Aniki. If you know, you know. In Japan, this is considered kusoge. It means crap game, and that's true. It carries a cult following, however, and if you want to be part of Nakagata's mescaline-fueled fever dream, be prepared to dump just shy of $500 for it. Yikes. Did you ever find yourself so obsessed with math that you just really wanted to do it on the NES? And not just any math. No. Eat ass, Math Blast, you green little fuck. I require a gorilla to teach me. Fetch me Donkey Kong. Either way, $600 is a lot of money to be bored with. Think of all the money paper airplanes you could make out of dollar bills. 600 individual George Washingtons flying off into the horizon, never to come back into your bank account again. That's what this game is to me. This one is known for being a black sheep in the Donkey Kong franchise, but it wasn't unheard of for Nintendo to take their flagship IPs and introduce the concept of edutainment. In some ways, let them put their foot in the door to get their products in front of children. Even Mario had a few, with Mario's Time Machine and Mario is Missing. And while I'd rather watch a century plant bloom in slow motion than play them, I understand the relevance in a market and the demographic that they were going for. It's just a very expensive tutor. And that's it for today. What's the most expensive NES game in your collection? I'd love to hear, and I know that others in the community might want to as well. It's a great time to brag and just show how much the market has changed throughout the years. We're really close to that 4,000 subscriber goal, and that wouldn't be possible without you, the viewer. So thank you. And if by chance you haven't subscribed, please do consider it. We're a community chock full to the brim with video game enthusiasts and a desire to remember a time when life was just a little bit easier to live. Finally, the single most important thing you can do for me is to hit that thumbs up button, as it directly impacts the visibility of the videos and projects I work on every single day. As always, from my family to your family, good energy, good vibes, Fortefyre out.